everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Eat My Globe, a podcast that tells you things you didn't know about food. And on today's very special episode, we're looking at the patchwork of experiences that go together to form the island that is Jamaica, in the hands of one of its finest exponents, Melissa Thompson. Melissa's background has taken her from Dorset, I believe, in England, being born to a Jamaican father and, I think, a Maltese mother. Through being a journalist to forming her own pop-up restaurant, cooking, I believe, Japanese food, which is very exciting to me, to now being one of the finest food writers in the UK, a winner of the Guild of Food Writers Award in 2021, and now delivering the wonderful work and subject of today's chat, Motherland. So, Eat My Globe listeners, please welcome Melissa Thompson.
Thank you very much, Sam. That is quite the introduction.
Well, I like to do a nice introduction. So, Melissa Thompson, I think with a lot of people in the US, but a lot of people in the UK as well, you know, we didn't know much about Jamaica. You know, we don't know about its history. So this podcast is going to be talking about it. I know when I went there, I absolutely loved it. You know, so what I want to do to you is talk about this fascinating and flavor-filled island on the globe, Jamaica. So before we start, let's talk a bit about yourself and your magnificent book. Perhaps you could tell us about who you are and why this subject is so special to you.
So, as you said, I am a food writer primarily, and I also, you know, I cook a lot. I work with sort of a barbecue company, Weber. I do a lot of barbecue stuff, kind of grilling. And then other bits, like sort of bits on radio, and just kind of, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I come from a journalistic background. I started on my local paper back in Dorset, the Dorset Echo, and then kind of worked my way up to national newspapers, to interviews. And then, yeah, the food kind of started through, I was always cooking, but then the food came through a supper club. Like, as you said, my sister-in-law is Japanese and introduced me to karaage chicken. And I would make it all the time. And then eventually kind of started a supper club, a bit on a whim, really. And that kind of grew, and then I ended up doing kind of pop-ups and taking over different spaces. And, you know, I always cook lots of different food. I come from a background, my parents, because they're both from different places, and my dad was in the Royal Navy, so he would cook, travel around the world and then kind of cook food from different places. And so, you know, growing up, I was always exposed to like lots of different cuisines. And then like Jamaican food was always kind of quite a big part of that, you know, kind of. And then when I started cooking for myself, like for my friends, I cook a lot of Jamaican food. And then I found myself cooking kind of more Jamaican food as I got older. And then I think for me, it was almost just a kind of national. I'm a curious person anyway, especially being a journalist. And I was always curious as to the origins of the food that I loved, but I never really kind of considered their origins. And sometimes the origin stories of different foods become known. Like, you know, I know that tarte tatin happened by accident, right, in a French kitchen, apparently. And but I didn't know why, for instance, ackee and saltfish, why those two quite disparate things ends up on a plate and working so well together. Or the history of oxtail, or like, you know, like why is there this traditional curry in Jamaica? And even down to the story of jerk, right? Because jerk is probably one of Jamaica's most famous exports, and like, what are the origins? And actually, the more I found out, the more I wanted to know, and the more that you could just see there was this kind of like direct correlation between the people, the circumstances, and the massive movement that was going on kind of in the sort of, you know, like starting in the 16th century, but 17th century, 18th century, 19th century especially, and kind of all these ingredients kind of like, you know, swapping borders, and these people that were swapping borders either through their own free will or being kind of because they were being enslaved and stolen to different countries. And that's where it came out, really. I'm quite a nosy person when it comes to food. I love learning about stories and people. And when you have food as that like kind of common thread kind of winding through all of it, for me, it's just fascinating.
Before we go on, I have to just admit another link. When I was in publishing in the UK many, many moons ago, we used to publish all the Weber cookbooks. So I just mentioned that as well.
Wow,
so that's amazing. Another, yeah, we used to go to the Weber University in Chicago and all of that stuff. So, I mean, that's just another thing that came
Very
out.
cool.
We used to publish for Denmark. We used to publish for all these different countries around Europe, as well as for the UK. So I just mentioned that that came in, and we haven't published. I mean, MQP has unfortunately gone bust, but we used to publish all the books for them. So that was very fascinating. Anyway, that's just a thing that's going on here. So perhaps let's go on to this. And before we go on, I read all the way through your amazing book. But just so people can understand, you do mention the Windrush generation, and your grandfather, I think, was part of that, who came over. Just because people in the UK may not know it, but people in the US won't know it really, perhaps you could just talk to us about what the Windrush generation is, because that's fascinating to me. And really, my father came over in a sort of thing from India as well. So I'd just love to know about that.
Yeah, so the Windrush, it was actually both my parents, both my dad's parents, his mum and his dad, who came to the UK. They were invited by the government, kind of in this post-war effort to rebuild, and being part of the empire, part of the Commonwealth, were invited. It was called the Windrush because it was actually the first boat to make that trip was called the HMS Windrush, and so this was in the 50s. The first trip was when was it? It was I want to say 52 or basically it was in the kind of the early 50s that the first trip the Windrush was the first sort of trip the Windrush made, and so people were kind of brought in to do different jobs, and it's quite funny because you hear from people now, and unfortunately my grandparents died before I even thought to have these conversations with them, but because people were invited to help, they kind of were expecting quite a warm welcome, and a lot of them didn't have a very warm welcome, right? And it's the classic is people having signs in their sort of white British people having signs in their like with B&Bs and things like that, having signs in there saying no blacks, no dogs, and no Irish, or no blacks, no Irish, and no dogs, and so then you had pockets in the UK of where people could get black people, Jamaicans could get lodging. It was often kind of really extortionate for not very nice conditions, and so you have pockets like sort of Brixton being the best known, and so the generation was over that period of years where people were kind of invited over here. My parents came over I think in 56. My dad was born in 55, and my dad stayed in Jamaica, which again is quite a common thing. So his parents came over to kind of establish themselves, and then my dad came over when he was 9, and got a massive shock to the system, and had his parents who were strangers to him. So obviously they didn't see each other over that time. He had new siblings who were strangers to him. My grandparents had tried to kind of almost become more entrenched in British society, and so my dad came over with quite a strong Jamaican accent. He was the first black child at his school, and so got faced a lot of racism, and so it's and then even more recently, there's been a scandal, the Windrush scandal with the current Conservative government, and people because when people came as children, they just kind of came and they worked and they paid taxes, but then because say some of them didn't kind of become like British residents, through no fault of their own, and some people got deported, and some people went back to Jamaica. Well, you say went back to Jamaica, they hadn't been since they were children, so this place was like fairly alien, and it's just been absolutely outrageous, and kind of really exposes a lot of the kind of deep-seated, deep-rooted issues that Britain still faces with racism.
No, absolutely. And I know that the way you talk about it is the way that my father, who was married, he was married to a woman from Wales. So it's a very separate way of looking at it. But he had the same. He was going, how could you look at a country that had nearly 1 billion people there and discover it being a British thing? And they brought them over, to this country.
And some of the narrative, I think. Yeah, well, yeah, totally. And a lot of the narratives are very similar, kind of, and I think that definitely happened with the British Empire in India. And it's, the language used by the British about these people are like sort of savages and we are here to civilize them. And then you look at the actions of the British and how savage they were in their treatment. And it's just, it's really, I guess we'd almost call it, what would you call it? What is it? Sort of almost like gaslighting. You're kind of you're sort of transferring your own issue onto other people, kind of calling them savages. And a lot of these places were just already quite established and worked, you know, I mean, they worked perfectly fine. And yet the British came along and just kind of unleashed just violence and you know, caused issues that still continue today.
No, absolutely. And one of the things I wanted to talk about with that is how this impacted your food, because for me, Indian food is not just going there because it's part of my history. It's going there because it's part of my history, if that means sense. And these, the foods that I make from there, and I look at the British Indian restaurant food, and I look at the actual Indian food, and that makes me very kind of confident there. And when I go there, I feel more in tune with it. How does it make you feel when you go to Jamaica? Do people look at you in a different way? Do you, when you go in to cook the food, does that come out as that? Because I want to know how you're treated in Jamaica really as well.
I think I have, when I go to Jamaica, I have just I have a really nice time. I think it's one of those places that, when you go, and I have this, and I have it even like to my parents when they while Melissa's going to Jamaica, and then their parents, so their friends go and offer advice, even to people who are Jamaican themselves, and like, be careful. Even one of my mum's friends said to her to pass on to me to not speak to anyone because they'd know I was British from my accent. It's like, what? And it's completely fine. And again, I think coming back to food, I think food helps kind of foster those, or like build those kind of connections, because you can just talk about food, what's gone into there, like how have you done that? And I think people love talking about food. When you work in food, it's just nice to have a conversation. It's nice to, I have it if I'm cooking food and someone's genuinely interested in what you've done, because you put your heart into this dish, or into what you do, especially if you're doing it day in, day out, and someone appreciates it. It's really nice. What I found about the food, the food that I have here, because I think I talk in the book about how food has always been used as a way to anchor yourself to somewhere that you've been removed from, and obviously I was born in the UK, and so the Jamaican food, when I went to Jamaica, was almost anchored for me, like back home. Like it kind of, the nostalgia I felt was almost nostalgia for Britain, eating the food, because that's where I first experienced it. And also I remember thinking, like, blimey, like, the sort of the Jamaicans in the UK have done the food justice, because it was so, like, obviously it's familiar, but you kind of expect, I think where you have this kind of like British Indian cuisine, where so people doing, and I remember being part of a discussion with Cyrus Todawala and someone else whose name I've forgotten, and Cyrus was talking about when he opened his first restaurants in the UK, people wouldn't go because he was cooking like Indian dishes from India, and people were like, where's, like, I don't know, like sort of like chicken tikka masala, like where is this? And so at first it was almost like, oh my gosh, no one's going to come and eat my food. And there hasn't really been that fusion with Jamaican food. There's been attempts at it, but because they are always so kind of like substandard compared to the real deal, they've never really become part of the Jamaican British repertoire. Jamaican food that you have in England is Jamaican food. There might be sort of slight substitutions to it, because I don't know, like pimento in the UK is never going to be as fragrant and sort of like nuanced as it is in Jamaica. But largely the Jamaican food that you have here, and also, like if you're cooking Jamaican food and your customer base is Jamaican, they do not suffer fools gladly. Like, your food has to be good, otherwise you will go out of business really quickly.
Well, let's talk about how the food came together, because that you go through all the different people who come in to make that amazing community that you get in Jamaica. And I know, when I went there and we shared the food there, it was amazing. Now, let's go through, because you do mention it. I'm guessing from the community that you have there, the Redware people, kind of the earliest people there, there's probably not much of their cuisine that exists. So you're not getting much of that, I'm guessing, unless it's gone on to the Taino and all of those people.
Yeah, so the Redware kind of became assimilated into the Taino people, and sort of, like, archaeologists don't know if that was done by force or if it was just like a gradual kind of assimilation. I think it is believed that it's more like a gradual assimilation. So there isn't very much known about them. We know that they generally made their camps near water. So so that seafood was kind of part of the diet. But it's really the Taino that we know, because they were the first people, the first to have European contact, and it was the Europeans who recorded what they saw. So that's how we know, and we know kind of their use of cassava and how important cassava was to the Taino, the kind of who are regarded as indigenous Jamaicans, and they cultivated like maize and sweet potato and things like that.
And what did they? So let's talk about some of those dishes, because I'm guessing some of those have passed through even to the future, to the present now. Let's talk about cassava and sweet potato. And these are things that people might know, a little bit in the US, a little bit, sweet potato probably even more. But tell us about how they use them.
So, I mean, I guess the most famous is the cassava, and so for me, I mean, I dedicated a lot of space in the book to cassava, because cassava's, I think, wonderful, and it was very important. And there are some of the earliest notes. So there was a Spanish guy who wrote about these cassava flatbreads that the Taino made, and then Hans Sloane, who may not be known to US audiences, but he was a botanist, and he was a physician. He was a physician to the first British governor of Jamaica, and went over there for a couple of years. And he did this kind of like these 2 massive volumes where he recorded everything that he found there. So it's fascinating, kind of all the things that are brought there. And obviously the Spanish had brought loads of plants. I mean, they brought like sugarcane, which obviously sugarcane would then become really important. They brought banana, they brought plantain. They brought like loads of different things. They brought a lot of animals, a lot of livestock. So they brought goats, and they brought pigs, those pigs. A lot of the animals they brought would end up becoming wild, and those pigs proved very important later on with the kind of with the emergence of jerk. But cassava, these records, and they write about this preparation of cassava, where you grate the cassava, you squeeze the liquid out of it, and then you kind of toast it over like a sort of a panel thing to make over fire, and it makes bread, because like cassava, and known as manioc, known as yucca elsewhere. So American audiences might maybe know better as yucca, and then it kind of melts together without any kind of any egg or any kind of water in there, or any kind of binder. And it just makes these like cassava flatbreads. And they were really important to the Taino, because they would enable travel, because these cassava flatbreads would last for up to a year, which is unheard of like back in the day, before refrigeration. So that enabled them to like go in their canoes, and they had amazing canoes, and like kind of travel island to island and trade and discover new lands. And so what blows my mind is that you have Bammy, and Bammy today are those cassava flatbreads. So you can draw a direct line from those cassava flatbreads to Bammy, and then you have a dish. So Bammy will be served maybe like most like commonly with fried fish, Escovitch fried fish, and Escovitch fried fish. Yeah. I mean, I think the idea of like frying fish maybe has like a bit of an African influence, but then the Escovitch is definitely from the Spanish, and Escovitch in Spanish means like to pickle, and so you have this kind of like sweetened vinegary kind of like liquor with vegetables in it that you pour over the fried fish, and then you've got like your fried Bammy on the side that's been soaked in maybe like coconut milk or even just in water, and then it's been fried. And it's so nice. And then you have like the vinegary liquid that soaks into the cassava, and you just eat it, and it's, my goodness, it's so tasty. And so on that, just on that one plate, you've got the influence of the Spanish, you have the influence of the Taino, and maybe kind of a bit of the African influence as well. And it's just like, so there are so many dishes like that in Jamaican cuisine, where on one plate you have all of these different influences, and they just come together to create something absolutely magical.
Yeah, I have to say, part of the reason is the way you describe it. It's just absolutely fantastic. And I've had Bammy when I was there, but I never made that connection, which is really, I mean, it is just fantastic. So let's talk about, you've talked about the Spanish and also the British communities. And we talked about sugar plantations, and sugar plantations became, the reason in effect why Jamaica kind of carried on in a way. And so let's talk about the sugar plantations, because obviously how they were used in Jamaica, but obviously what they also did exporting. I remember, and in fact I did last season, I wrote my own essay on the history of rum and how they sold the molasses to New England, who then sold it around the world, created rum in New England and then sold it around the world. And in fact, rum was almost more important than the Boston Tea Party So let's talk about sugarcane, and then let's talk about some of the other influences that Spanish had and the British had.
Yeah, sure. So, the island of Barbados was the first, within the Caribbean, the first kind of slave society. So, initially when the Spanish came under Columbus, they were looking for gold. That was it. They were looking for gold and gold and spices and like things to trade. And they, as soon as they saw the Taino, the people, Spanish, Columbus's diaries were like, they're quite timid people. They seem friendly. They would make good servants. And I think we'll be able to convert them to Christianity. So right off the bat, that was his intention. And so then a lot of the Taino, because a very common narrative in the West is that the indigenous people died through a lack of immunity to these new diseases that that they'd never seen before, and that did happen. There were like instances of smallpox and things like that. But actually, the Spanish, it was through their brutality that a lot of the Taino died. Some committed suicide too. Like they used cassava to commit suicide because it was so brutal, and so then. There was a lot of, because so actually like people kind of, the Spanish, like Jamaica became this kind of like backwater that it was almost used to kind of like livestock became overgrown. There was like agriculture, almost like a supply base for the Spanish's interest in the area.
Okay.
And then you have Barbados under the British, and they kind of cottoned on because you had South America, Brazil, that was, like producing lots of, like, under the Portuguese and the Dutch, and they were producing like a lot of sugar. And sugar was this like really expensive commodity, white gold, Europe couldn't get enough of, like the elite in Europe couldn't get enough of. And then so the British, even though Barbados was very small by comparison, it was like perfect growing conditions, and so it became very profitable. And that's when the chattel slavery from West Africa, like West and Central Africa, really ramped up. And so then when the British took over Jamaica in 1655, not immediately, like it was kind of like they knew exactly what they wanted to do with the island. So ramped up, and Jamaica saw more enslaved people arrive on its shores than any other Caribbean island. Not that it ended up that it was really populated, because it was also one of the most brutal. So a lot of people died. A lot of the enslaved population died very young, because it was just backbreaking work, working for ridiculous hours, very dangerous work as well. And so then that was when the cultivation of sugar really ramped up. And then you also had other kind of, like sort of some of the land given over to the livestock and things like that. But it was just an absolute moneymaker, because you had, your only expenditure apart from like with the equipment was in people. And then, and that's why, then you have issues of sort of like sexual violence, because it was almost like to repopulate from within, not having to buy. And so it's just an absolutely like shameful part of the history that funded, there are I talk about when I was growing up in Weymouth, and whenever we left the county, I would drive past this really long wall, and it really fascinated me, because at some point you have these animals on top of this wall, and obviously kids like animals, and then you have this big archway and it's got a big deer on top, and I was so transfixed with this. And then when I got older and I ended up working on the local paper, I learned that place that I was so fascinated with, that wall was actually the perimeter of the Drax estate, and the Drax family were massive players in the slave trade. They were massive players in Barbados, and then they came to Jamaica, and the Drax and the descendant James Drax, who lives there, is now the MP of the area in which I grew up, of South Dorset. And so it shows all these weird stories. So that's kind of the importance of sugar, because it helped fund the Industrial Revolution in Britain. A lot of the ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and obviously London absolutely flourished through the proceeds of slavery. A lot of businesses. I mean, there's like kind of like big businesses, big insurance companies, and it was state sanctioned. It wasn't separate. It wasn't like this kind of like underground thing. It was very much kind of state sanctioned enslavement of people for the benefit of few.
Well, and it is now. I mean, I think, and maybe you mentioned this in your book, it's like 90% now is from the African community that's come over there, which is just, I mean, an enormous amount, and is certainly true in Brazil, and certainly in certain areas of Brazil. So let's look at those people, because I mean, they first of all, they added a lot to the food, obviously, but also how they added to the whole community. So let's look at that. The enslaved, African men and women. These represent, say 90% of the community, which shows, I mean, just the extraordinary number of people who came over to the community. But this was obviously, one of the most iniquitous tragedies of the time, but it had an impact on the food. So perhaps you could just talk to us about the food side of it and how that even represented their community back home.
So you have, I think, Simon, one of the craziest things about it for me is that it took me, it took me a while to realize that I was descended from enslaved people, because I was, as a kid, I was like, my mum was Maltese, my dad was Jamaican, and I thought the Jamaican population, and obviously there's movement of people, but it was only until I was a bit older that I was like, oh my gosh, so my ancestors were part of this enslavement, and it was just, it's quite wild. And since I've done my DNA and things and found out kind of like sort of how I'm rooted to sort of West Africa, like a bit of there's sort of like Nigeria mainly, but then kind of other countries along the coast, and that's that's pretty extraordinary. And so there was this massive movement of people. I mean, and also people from Africa were like, we owe a lot to Africa's kind of like ingenuity in terms of like farming and in terms of like cultivation. And so it was people were brought over to work, but also they had amazing know-how, and I don't think that was accidental, in terms of how to like work the land, and animal husbandry and things like that, and so they just really knew what they were doing, and people had like provision grounds where you would grow stuff like any kind of yam, cassava, cocoa yam, like lots of different things, and you have your plantain, like green plantain, and so you still have that tradition today of having hard food. So on the side of your plate you have your hard food, or in soups and you have your hard food, kind of like starchy vegetables that were going to give you energy, and you also have like the one pot cuisine, and also in terms of dealing with offal. I mean, I think especially in the UK, you have all these kind of like buzzwords. You have like your vegan food, you have your like nose to tail eating, and also just the idea of being resourceful, especially with the climate crisis, and actually like sort of Jamaican, and not just Jamaicans, but a lot of these cultures who people haven't necessarily paid that much attention to their food have been doing this sort of thing for years. I joke that if an alien was to land in the UK, they would and read the literature around vegan food, they would think it was started by like a white woman in West London, like in 2010, and actually. I mean, like you look at India, like in the traditional kind of like of plant-based food and veg-forward food. Yeah, and it's like it's so important part of these cultures. And so in terms of like look at oxtail, like as a one-pot dish, and just this kind of the resourcefulness of turning something that is very, very tough, that was kind of almost dismissed by the plantation owners. And now, oxtail is very expensive. It is delicious.
Yes,
it's like one of my most favourite things. And so that's what we have, to thank the people for. But then also, I mean, a lot of the dishes like ackee and saltfish. Ackee is, I think it's still banned in America. I think sometimes it goes.
You can only get it in the US in a can. Okay. Rather than, and so that is because there's Jamaican shops around here, but you can only get it in a can rather than being fresh.
Okay, because in parts of America you'd have the climate, right, to be able to grow it, probably.
Yeah, absolutely, but you only get it basically in a can, which is, I've cooked it here and it's fine, but it's not the same as getting it fresh.
No, absolutely not. And so so that came over. The ackee came over from modern day Ghana at the end of the 18th century, and then the sort of saltfish, which was being consumed all around. But then I think it's the enslaved people who this idea of one pot cooking, but also cooking in one pot and cooking things down. because I mean the saltfish wasn't very pleasant. You have mackerel rundown that was made with salted mackerel and coconut milk and just kind of like cooked down probably, and then mixed other things probably to mask the flavor. You know, I mean, these things weren't recorded, but you can imagine the circumstances. When you know the circumstances, you can imagine like, their evolution. Yeah. And so, you know, like I guess ackee and saltfish rundown. We have to, you know, to thank the people from Africa, who created these like incredible dishes that have sort of survived. You know, and I think it blows my mind.
One of the things that I should just mention that I did an interview last season with Michael Twitty, who's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful writer. And he talked about how people coming from Africa the ladies would put the African rice in their hair. So it was, and then they would use it when they got there, but it was considered by the slave owners as just a decoration. But when they got there, they would use it to plant the African rice, which was, and I think that kind of thing comes over from Africa all the time. We see all those uses, and so it obviously went to Jamaica and to the different islands in the Caribbean just as much. And I think that's really important because, you know, again, in England and different countries, we think of, you know, or the people sometimes think of, you know, these wonderful people coming over from Nigeria or wherever, and they don't realize just how useful and how purposeful they were with the food that they brought over. So for me, when I talked to him, that was just amazing. And you're saying the same. And it's something that they never, I mean, the people in America, the white people in America, just never really think about. So I think that's important.
Apparently, I mean, just to say about that, with ackee seeds, there were lots of reports about people wearing ackee seed necklaces as a sort of talisman to kind of bring good luck. And so there are other stories that's how ackee seeds came to Jamaica, but there's never been, I've never managed to find a kind of reliable source for that. It's almost like hearsay. But I think maybe that did happen, but I haven't been able to kind of confirm it.
I mean, it strikes me that it would do, because they were such, you know, as you said, such an ingenious, you know, range of countries.
And they're beautiful seeds as well. The ackee seeds are really beautiful, so you wouldn't sort of make something out of them.
I've never seen them, so that's really fascinating. I'm going to have to go and find out some work about this. I mentioned here, and it's one of the things that you talk about as well. In 1837, and they did away with slavery out of a form. That it was the slave owners who were paid, not the slaves who were paid. And I just find that absolutely astonishing. And in fact, I'm going to move on to the Indian and Chinese now, because they're a big part of Jamaican community. Because you look at curry, and I did a whole series on the history of curry about and we're on season 9 now, where we did how curry developed from there, came to England, so let's talk about curry powder first, because I make Jamaican curry powder. I make a range of curry powders here because that's just what I'm into. So I believe that it did come out of the the Indian community. Tell me about that, how the Indians came over, because they took over from the slaves, and how that created.
Yeah, so the sort of after the kind of the end of the abolishment of slavery took actually a few decades, and then when it finally was banned, then people the empire looked to other countries in the empire, so India and China, and there was the system of indentured servitude where you would pay a bond and then you'd have to kind of like pay it back, and you'd get kind of at the end of it was like normally like a sort of a 5-year period, and at the end of that you could either be sent back home, like have passage, or you would be given money and initially I think a piece of land, although I don't think that actually came to pass for very many people. And a lot of spices were already grown in Jamaica, so there's like different records, and I speak about it in the book about what was growing there, kind of in there's a particular area. This guy had this estate, and he was actually mixed race, and he owned slaves as well, and in his garden there was a kind of inventory after his death of everything that was growing there, and it includes like sort of different spices, and I think like turmeric was there, And but then it was the arrival of the people from India who really kind of introduced this idea. So like curry chicken and curry goat and curry mutton. So that was where kind of we have people from India to thank for that tradition. And then with the Chinese, the influence is kind of less obvious, but it's in ingredients. I mean, like, so some people with their jerk recipes, they might add soy sauce to it, and also just kind of like there's different types of like different noodle dishes and things that are kind of like a bit of a fusion, and just kind of, I don't know. I mean, like things like different sauces and different sort of chili sauces that are part of Jamaican cuisine and get used kind of like interchangeably sometimes. I've literally just had I was with a friend for lunch at having some jerk chicken, and they'd used a sort of a sweet chili sauce in the jerk gravy rather than using like a ketchup or a barbecue sauce, which it was a first for me at that place. But so it's quite interesting.
Oh, that's actually, that sounds really, really good. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about the dishes that people kind of know about Jamaican food, and let's talk about jerk chicken first, because I think that's has a relationship to the Taino, doesn't it? That kind of wild. So let's talk about that, and then let's talk about this later dish that came out of India, or not out of India, but was utilized by the Indians. So let's talk about jerk chicken, because it's probably the most famous, I guess, for people who don't go there. So tell us what jerk is.
So jerk is both a kind of a noun and a verb, right? So like to jerk is to cook a protein. It actually started with pigs, wild pigs, but I guess like jerk chicken is probably the most common now. But then it's also the noun, like it is the dish is called jerk, and it started in the mountains of Jamaica. So when the British took over from the Spanish in 1655, the Spanish had already introduced some form of chattel slavery from Africa, but it was kind of not of a great scale. Like it wasn't kind of as purposeful, should we say, as it was under the British, and not at that point anyway. And then so the people, the enslaved people that were there, either like escaped from them or were released. I think even some Spanish people went to go live in the mountains. And this isn't some sort of like like sort of romantic kind of Swiss like picture of like people like sort of skipping through the mountains. Like it was quite harsh terrain and quite hard to get to. But again going back to and then these people were called Maroons. I think it comes from the Spanish word cimarron, which I think means kind of like tame or something. That's where the name is said to come from. And there were some Taino who had survived also, and we get from the Taino spoke an Arawak language, and we get the word barbecue from that language, like barbacoa, and that was to like kind of cook over like a platform, kind of a wooden platform, and over fire. And so between them, because the British were then trying to recapture these Marines, because it wasn't for lots of reasons, because the Marines would go and carry out raids on the British camps, and and if any enslaved people left, then they would go to the mountains and join these Marine communities. And it was quite difficult for the British, even though they had arms, because they were so treacherous, like the routes were really treacherous. It was hard for them to get there, and they didn't know the terrain, right? So the Marines had they had one over them. They had several over them, in fact. And so they would capture what were these wild pigs, and then they would cook them, and they would kind of season them as much to flavor the meat as much to preserve the meat as to flavor. And they would wrap them in leaves, and then they would bury them and cook them underground so that it didn't give away too much smoke that would reveal their position to the British.
Right. Okay.
And as well, the British had this massive PR exercise because they wanted more British people to come over to kind of help build kind of a bit more of a community. But if you have people who are who you have enslaved, and you're enslaving their brethren, and they're kind of free and watching you, it's not kind of like you're kind of watching your back, and so then eventually a treaty was formed. And so there was a bit more freedom of movement between the Maroons. The Maroons agreed not to kind of, there are lots of different stories. So the Maroons agreed to return any escapees back to the plantations. Whether they did or not is kind of, up for discussion. And so then you have these reports. So this guy, Hans Sloane, again, he spoke about watching them jerk a pig. And so the jerking in that sense is almost using a knife to like stab holes through it so you can kind of get that seasoning like sort of penetrating as much of the surface area as possible. And then after these treaties were signed, you have these records of people like coming down into the towns and with a big hunk of like pork and then kind of like slicing it off to order. And then it was first sold. I know. Like, can you imagine how good it would have been? It was first sold commercially in Boston, and in Boston today, there are still kind of like the jerk pits of Boston. And yeah, if anyone goes to Jamaica, like I thoroughly recommend going there because it's just like the bustle of it, the kind of the smells, and you have like because it looks so like jerk has to be like pimento has to be part of the jerk preparation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's cooked over pimento wood and it kind of like infuses the flavor, but you also have the pimento berries in the jerk marinade. And back here in England, I could probably get pimento wood, but it wouldn't be very sustainable. So I instead use bay leaves, which are everywhere. And I use like bay branches and I create like a kind of a blanket, put the chicken or pork on top of that, and then cook it that way. And some pimento berries soaked in water directly on the coals.
And let's talk about the other one, which I absolutely love, curry goat, because it has that kind of Indian spice to me as well. I absolutely love it. But now here's the first thing. I've got to ask this because one of the first things I ever saw was someone who put HP sauce into their curry goat. And I don't know if that comes from anywhere, if it comes from Jamaica, where they do have, HP sauce. But that was just something I saw when I was in Jamaica, and that's the only place I saw it. So I just love that. Is that something you ever heard about? I've got to ask it anyway.
No, it's not. But there's, I think I've seen. Oh no, I have seen that. But I think that was in a recipe by a British person. Actually, someone put HP sauce, I think, in their curry goat recipe. Yeah, it's not something I can see it working because you got to have the kind of the fruitiness and it's like sort of like vinegariness of it, but. It's not something I don't put HP sauce in mine. I put it in my bacon sandwiches, not in my curry.
I'm glad to hear that it's not then part of that, or not, unless it's coming from a British guy. But tell me just a little bit about curry goat, because all with that spices and everything in it, that strikes me as this beautiful Indian Jamaican mix that I have going. So what's in that?
So you have the kind of the mix of spices, which is, it's quite like a turmeric heavy spice blend. And there's also pimento in there as well. And you have like your cumin. I put fenugreek in mine, and a bit of coriander. And you can put a bit of paprika in it as well. In my curry blend, I put a bit of paprika as well. And then you like sort of leave it to sort of marinate. You want your kind of garlic, your ginger, your bit of Scotch bonnet. The Scotch bonnet goes in whole. And then I brown my goat meat. Some people don't. They kind of add it to the pan with water. You want your thyme in there as well. And then the whole Scotch bonnet. And then cook it down, because I think browning meat. It's just like I live for like kind of that sort of the browning meat smell and taste. And then you cook it down, and it ends up in a bit of coconut milk as well in it, and like towards the end, and then some potatoes, and it ends up being like it's quite a light, like sort of the sauce is quite light. It's quite watery almost. It's not a really thick one because you're not cooking out. There's not like loads of onions that you're cooking out for a long time to thicken it. So it ends up being sort of quite like not a water. I mean, it's got so much flavour and so much substance to it, but it's just not really thick. It's not a really thick sauce, and it's just delicious. A bit of rice and peas, maybe some roti.
And I've learned something there, because I always cook it more down like a curry.
Okay.
And it has a slightly watery, and that's something new to me. So if nothing else, I've learned how to cook a proper curry goat. So that's fantastic. Hi everybody, this is Simon Majumdar, the creator and host of the Eat My Globe Food History podcast. Now, those of you who have been listening to the podcast since we began over 2 years ago, nearly 50 episodes so far, will know that we have never sought out sponsorship for the podcast. It's very much been a labour of love. However, along the way, a large number of people have approached us suggesting they would like to support the podcast. And so, we have opened up a page on patreon.com to allow those of you who listen regularly to do just that. Any support we will get
will allow us to purchase research materials, buy ingredients for recipes, and maybe, when we can get out and about, to bring you some very special in-the-field reporting. But, and this is really important, this is not just a one-way street. For varying levels of membership of our Patreon club, there will be access to fantastic Eat My Globe swag, including that incredible chopping board so many of you have written to me about, recipes based on historical periods about which we chat each week, video shout-outs, signed pictures, and even along the way some very special episodes just for members. So, if you've enjoyed the episodes of Eat My Globe you've listened to so far and would like us to make many more into the future, do head over to www.patreon.com/eatmyglobe and consider taking out a membership. Any support will be much appreciated. Remember, that's www.patreon.com/eatmyglobe. So thank you very much. Keep listening.
And now I want to talk just in the end, just a little bit before we bring you on to some fun questions. Hopefully these have been fun anyway, but just some fun questions. I want to talk about these breads, starches, things like patties, which I make at home here. Although we can't get Scotch bonnets here unless we go out, we tend to get habaneros, which are not as warm, but we just, because of the Mexican community, and we have a great community of people from South America, but we don't get a lot of the Scotch bonnets. But anyway, things like patties, things like the breads, things like Johnny cakes. I mean, there's a whole range of this in Jamaica, and I want to know where that came from, because is it coming from lots and lots of different communities? Because you have rotis there in Barbados, and you have that coming over as well.
Yeah, so we have rotis, and roti, I mean, like in Trinidad is kind of with the sort of there's a much bigger Indian community in Trinidad, and that tells them the cuisine, and so you have like patties, they say that maybe there's a connection between patties and like sort of pasties in the UK. There are with some of the bakes and stuff, like I said, bun there's meant to be a link between bun and hot cross buns. In the UK, you have like your fruit cakes, like your rum cakes, again kind of like transference of ideas, and black cake in the Caribbean, and kind of the influence of the British in that way. And then you have, so wheat was quite late to Jamaica, and actually I think the first wheat came from like mainland America, and so you had
okay.
But I mean, I guess like there wasn't even like not a lot. There was cornbread that were like bread made from maize, but that wasn't as common, and also it spoiled quite quickly, because I think the Taino made bread with maize, but it just wasn't as cassava bread was preferred because it would last longer. And then you have, I mean, there are so many different like dumplings in like literally, I was saying that I was having lunch today. So I had it at Maureen's down the road in Brixton, between Brixton and Herne Hill. And so we had chicken soup. And in that you have your boiled round dumplings, and you have your spinners, which are like the long dumplings that are really easy to make, really quick. And then we had fried dumpling on the side. So just in that, and I had I had curry chicken actually for my main. So just in that one meal, I've got three different types of dumpling, and then you've also got your festival, which has got a bit of cornmeal in it, and it's fried, but it's like a sweetened dough.
It's just
it's just I mean it's just become part of the part of the repertoire, and I think because of the kind of the nature of work in Jamaica, you have a lot of starchy foods, and the good thing about dumplings is that they bulk something up, because for like any other soup apart from Jamaican soups, I think I don't really see them as a meal. But then with Jamaican soups, they fill me up, because they've got like your boiled dumpling in there, your spinners, and it's just and you have all your hard food in there as well. So it's like it fills you up. It's a proper meal. You can go and do a day's work on the back of it.
I have to say, I just have to go back to Jamaica now.
You do.
We had some great times, and I have to ask you one question, maybe that you don't have an answer, but of the two main patties people who sell them, one was it called? There's
Tasty,
one called
Tasty and Juicy.
That's it, Tasty and Juicy. Do you have a choice? Did you particularly like?
No, I mean, and this is a very charged question, Simon. I mean,
Sure.
I mean, don't make me decide. It's like choosing my best children, my favorite children. No, to be honest, I will like. I mean, I really like. I like the fried chicken at Tasty Chicken at Tasty's Patty. So I will get a bit of fried chicken if I had the choice. I'd go there. So I'd get a patty and I'd get a bit of fried chicken. But I don't really mind. Like my mate Jax is very much a juicy patties person, so she just thinks she thinks I'm an absolute loser for going into Tasty. But a patty's a patty.
Oh, that's nice. Now, we're going to just finish with, apart from giving you time to give everyone how they can reach you and find all about you, which I know they're going to want to do after listening to this, because you've been fantastic. We're going to just do some fun questions. As I said, I hope the other questions were fun, but these are just even more fun. So, fun questions. So if Melissa was a meal, what would it be?
Oxtail. I'd be oxtail because oxtail takes a long time to cook, but it's worth it when you get there. And it might take me a long time to get around to doing something, but I promise it'll be worth it when I finally get around to it. And it's tasty. It's good.
And that is a great answer. That's fantastic. Okay, if you had to pick one period in history or a great meal in history, and it could be from any time, it could be outside of, obviously your knowledge about Jamaica, but it could be Jamaica. What would your meal be, or what was your one period in history be?
I mean, I think I'd love to be in Jamaica pre-Columbus and just in like watching people prepare food, watching like the cassava flatbreads being made, like the Bammy, watching like them grilling fish and watching them catching the fish.
No.
They had ingenious ways of doing it. So just being part of like an everyday meal there. Well, I mean, but when they had guests, they would like kind of really roll it out for them. So I would have loved to have witnessed that and just kind of see a snippet of their lives before they were before the Europeans ruined it for them.
I think that's a great answer as well, because you are relating it back to there. And here, this is another question. This is the only, what is, do you think, the greatest invention in food history? And yeah, I'd say we've kept it away now from everyone would say fire and everyone would say refrigeration, or everyone would say. So now let's try and find a new one. What would it be?
I think nixtamalization of maize is pretty clever. So nixtamalization of corn, I think, but also so that process, it blows my mind how you can create a completely different product and the kind of the legacy that has. But it's not really an invention. I think as an invention, will that do as an invention?
I think so, because someone had to watch and wait and then decide to eat it, and so I think that's a perfectly good one.
To even think of doing that and then how that, I mean, was it an accident or I don't know. I think that it blows my mind. But also a big shout out to the people who discovered that cassava and ackee were poisonous in some circumstances and persevered so that we could enjoy them, because I mean blimey, how many people had to die for us to be able to consume those.
I know. I think about that sometimes with the hakal in Iceland that they used to. It's the basking shark that they bring in and then bury in the snow and then hang up, and they go, how is this possible that someone discovered that? And you're like, oh well, so a couple of hundred people had to die along the way for us to have this rotten. But that's a fantastic one as well.
Finally, is that Simon? So is that because at some point is it poisonous, or is that because the liver can be quite toxic? Can't it?
No, it has. It has a little. I can't remember what it is, but alkaline below the skin, and so if they bury it in snow and whether people come along and pee on it, I don't know, but So people come along and then hang it up, and then it dries out, this alkaline, and then people come and eat it. And it was because they had this thing. This is totally different from what we're talking about, but they have this thing called Thor's Feast, and they were totally cut off in the time that would eat roast puffin and all of the things that they had there, and people would come along and eat this little bit of shark. You could have a little bit about this big, and it would basically clear the house, but people would come along and eat it, and that's why this little alkaline. So that's how they used to do it, but it's kind of how they did it, I don't know, but they did it with a couple of hundred people dying in the meantime.
Wow.
I know. But finally, let's make sure that everyone knows how to connect with you, because this has been fantastic, and I know they want to go and buy the book Motherland. So first of all, let's mention Motherland and its full title, and then let's talk about how they can find you on all of the other places.
So Motherland is a Jamaican cookbook. It's a cookbook, and it's got kind of your classic dishes: the oxtail, curry chicken, curry goat, patties, your ackee and saltfish fritters, and then it's all woven into the recipes are these stories and kind of the history of how these different foods made it to Jamaica, and the people who helped kind of hone the cuisine that we know today as Jamaican cuisine, like one of the most singular, incredible cuisines on the planet. And then you can find me. So my social media handles are Foul Mouth Food, foul like as in kind of like chicken, FOWL, Foul Mouth Food, and I've got a website that I don't really update very much. And I write for BBC Good Food magazine, and I write recipes for like The Guardian and stuff. So I've got a lot of like recipes and things online. And then, I mainly use Instagram. That's where I put a lot of my content and a lot of my recipes and a lot of my musings and things like that. So I share most of my stuff on Instagram.
That's fantastic. Melissa, first of all, I just want to thank you, because this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. And I didn't know as much about Jamaica as I did. And, I do a lot of history, which is what I do. And so this was absolutely brilliant. This was, I mean it, this was fantastic. So I just want to say to you, thank you so much. I know all the folks who listen to Eat My Globe are going to be very, very, keen on this as well. I want to just say thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed chatting with you. Thanks, Simon.
Do make sure to check out the website associated with this podcast at www.eatmyglobe.com, where we will be posting the transcripts from each episode, along with all the references and resources we used putting the episodes together, in case you want to delve deeper into each subject. There is also a contact button, so please do let us know if there are any subjects that you would like us to cover. And if you like what you hear, please don't forget to subscribe, recommend us to your family and friends, and give us a good rating on your favourite podcast provider. That really makes a difference. Thank you, and goodbye from me, Simon Majumdar, and we'll speak to you soon on the next episode of Eat My Globe, a podcast about things you didn't know about food. The Eat My Globe podcast is a production of It's Not Much But It's Ours and Producergirl Productions. Also, a huge thank you to Sybil Villanueva for her help with the research and the preparations of the transcripts for this episode, which can be found on the website.